Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The battlefield stretched out like a twisted canvas of devastation. Beneath the burning sky, the ground was littered with the broken remnants of war, shattered shields, discarded swords, and bodies. Human and elven alike lay silent, their once vibrant lives now just part of the earth. President Marion Everhart stood on a ridge overlooking the carnage, her heart heavy with the weight of the lives lost. The wind, carrying the acrid scent of smoke and death, whipped through her short-cropped hair, stinging her eyes, though she didn't flinch. She had seen far too much to let a battlefield unsettle her. But something inside her had broken long ago. She'd seen enough of war, enough of the bloodshed, enough of the hatred between her people and the elves. The conflict between the races had lasted centuries, and with every year that passed, it grew more senseless, more destructive. She glanced at her second-in-command, General Elias Roderick, his face hardened by years of battle. Elias, like most humans, had long since given up hope for peace. He saw only one solution to the problem they faced: a victory at any cost. "We've pushed them back, but it won't hold," Elias said, his voice rough with fatigue. His armor, though scratched and dirtied, shone in the dim light, a testament to his unwavering sense of duty. "They'll regroup. It's only a matter of time before they strike again." Marion closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. "How many died today?" Elias looked at her sharply, as if the question annoyed him. "Too many, but it's war, President. This is the price we pay to secure our future." "Our future," she murmured, shaking her head. "How much longer will we keep paying that price? How much more blood needs to be spilled before we stop and ask ourselves if it's worth it?" Elias frowned, the lines on his face deepening. "This isn't the time for doubt. We're close to breaking them. One more push, and we can cripple their forces for good." Marion turned to face him, her eyes piercing through the haze of smoke. "And then what? We kill their king? Burn their cities to the ground? How many more lives will that save, Elias?" The general stiffened, his jaw clenched. "It's the only way they'll ever respect us." "No," Marion said quietly. "There's another way." Elias blinked, taken aback by the calm resolve in her voice. She was always pragmatic, always level-headed, but now there was something else, something that unsettled him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we've been fighting for so long that we've forgotten what we're fighting for." Marion gestured to the battlefield below. "Look at this. This isn't victory. This is annihilation for both of our peoples. If we continue like this, there won't be anything left to save." Elias shifted uneasily. He knew Marion was different from the other leaders who had come before her. She didn't relish battle like the warlords of old, nor did she hunger for glory. But this was something else entirely. "You're talking about peace. I'm talking about ending this madness once and for all," Marion replied, her voice firm. "We can't win through sheer force. The elves are too entrenched, too resilient. But if we give them something greater than conquest, if we show them we're willing to sacrifice for peace, they might listen." Elias stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "Sacrifice? What are you suggesting?" Marion turned away, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the Elven kingdom lay hidden beyond the distant mountains. "I'll meet with their king, alone." Elias took a step forward, incredulous. "You can't be serious. They'll kill you the moment you step into their lands." "Maybe," Marion admitted, her voice soft but steady. "But if it means the end of this war, then it's a price I'm willing to pay." "No," Elias said, shaking his head. "I won't allow it." "You're the president. You're the only thing holding this nation together. If you die, everything we fought for will be for nothing." "If I don't go, there won't be anything left to hold together," Marion said firmly. "This war will tear us apart, Elias. You know that as well as I do. The elves aren't going to stop, and neither are we. But if I can convince them that peace is possibly, if I can make them see that we don't want their destruction, then maybe, just maybe, we can change the future." Elias clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "You're asking me to let you walk into the lion's den without any protection. It's suicide." Marion gave him a sad smile. "It's the only way." "They won't listen to anyone else." Elias looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had followed her into countless battles, trusted her judgment even when it went against his instincts. But this was different. "Marion, please. There has to be another way." She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip surprisingly strong. "This is the only way, Elias. Trust me." He swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew, deep down, that she was right. There was no end to this war if they kept fighting. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. "And what if you don't come back?" Marion's smile softened. "Then you'll carry on. You'll lead our people to a better future." Elias looked away, his jaw tight. "I don't want a future without you in it." "I know," she whispered. "But sometimes, we don't get to choose." The journey to the Elven capital was long and treacherous. Marion traveled with a small entourage, but she insisted on keeping her presence discreet. The last thing she wanted was to provoke suspicion or hostility. Lyra Sylviel, the Elven ambassador who had served as liaison between the two races for years, rode at her side, her delicate features betraying little of the anxiety she must have felt. "Do you really think this will work?" Lyra asked, her voice barely audible over the clatter of hooves on the rocky path. "I don't know," Marion admitted. "But we have to try." Lyra's silver hair shimmered in the fading light as she glanced at Marion. "King Alither isn't a man who trusts easily. He's seen too much betrayal, too much loss." "So have I," Marion replied, her gaze fixed ahead. "But if we don't trust each other now, we'll never find peace." The Elven kingdom came into view as they crested the final hill. It was a land of ethereal beauty, its towering spires and shimmering waterfalls a stark contrast to the human cities of stone and steel. Marion had always admired the elegance of Elven architecture, the way it blended seamlessly with nature rather than imposing upon it. But beneath that beauty, she knew, lay centuries of bitterness and resentment. They were met at the gates by a contingent of Elven guards, their sharp eyes trained on Marion and her party. Lyra stepped forward, speaking in the Elven tongue to announce their arrival. The guards hesitated for a moment, then nodded, allowing them entry. As they made their way through the streets of the Elven capital, Marion couldn't help but feel the weight of countless eyes upon her. She was an outsider here, a human among elves, and her presence was a reminder of the war that had ravaged both their lands. She saw the suspicion in their faces, the fear, and the anger. And yet, there was something else, a glimmer of hope, faint but undeniable. At last, they reached the grand hall where King Alither awaited. The door swung open with a creak, revealing the tall, imposing figure of the Elven king seated upon his throne. His silver crown glinted in the light, and his piercing green eyes studied Marion with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "President Marion Everhart," Alither's voice was as smooth as silk, yet it carried the weight of centuries. "I never thought I would see the day when a human leader would stand before me, unarmed and unguarded." Marion stepped forward, her head held high. "I come not as a conqueror, but as a messenger of peace." Alither raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Peace, a noble sentiment, though one I fear is in short supply these days." "Perhaps," Marion said, her voice steady. "But I believe it's still possible, if we're willing to make sacrifices." Alither's gaze hardened. "Sacrifices? You speak of sacrifices when your people have laid waste to my lands, slaughtered my kin, and driven us to the brink of extinction." Marion didn't flinch. "We've both suffered, Alither, humans and elves alike. We've both lost far too much. That's why I'm here to offer a way out." "And what is it you propose?" Alither asked, his tone sharp. Marion took a deep breath. This was the moment that would determine the fate of her people and the future of the continent. "I offer myself," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "My life, in exchange for peace." For a moment, there was silence in the hall. Then, A murmur rippled through the assembled elves, their disbelief palpable. Alithar's eyes narrowed as he rose from his throne, stepping down to stand before her. He towered over Marion, his presence commanding and fierce. "You offer your life?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you take me for a fool, human? Do you think such a gesture would erase the sins of your people?" Marion met his gaze, unafraid. "Number. But it might be enough to end the war." Alithar stared at her, his face unreadable. The silence between them stretched out, filling the great hall with tension so thick it seemed to weigh on everyone present. Marion's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground, keeping her gaze steady. She had come here with a singular purpose, and she would not falter now. Not when she was so close to achieving peace. Slowly, Alithar began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "You would give up your life," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "For what? To end a war that has raged for centuries? To offer your people's sworn enemies a victory on a silver platter?" "This isn't about victory," Marion replied. "It's about survival, for both our peoples." "And you believe that your death would ensure that survival?" "I believe that it would show your people that we are not your enemies. We want peace as much as you do. More, even. But this war, it's become a cycle, one we can't seem to break. Someone has to take the first step, someone has to make a sacrifice." Alithar stopped pacing and turned to face her, his piercing eyes studying her intently. "And you think you're that someone?" "I know I am," Marion said, "because I'm willing to pay the price." Alithar's expression remained stony. He regarded her in silence for what felt like an eternity, and Marion could feel the weight of every elf's gaze upon her. She knew that this moment could decide the fate of her people, of their future. But more than that, it could decide whether there was any future at all. At last, Alithar spoke. "You are a fool." The words hit her like a blow, but Marion held her ground. "Perhaps," she said, "but I'd rather be a fool than a coward. And I'd rather die knowing that I tried to save my people than live and watch them be destroyed." Alithar took a step toward her, his face inches from hers now, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made her heart race. "Do you know what you are asking? Do you truly understand the magnitude of what you propose?" "I do," Marion said, her voice firm. "And I understand the consequences if we do nothing." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, every elf and human watching, waiting for what would come next. Then, to Marion's surprise, Alithar laughed. It was a bitter, mirthless sound, filled with the weight of centuries of pain and loss. "You are remarkable, President Marion Everhart," he said, shaking his head. "Few humans have ever stood before me with such conviction. Fewer still have dared to offer themselves up as a sacrifice." "I'm not here for praise," Marion said quietly. "I'm here to end the war." Alithar's laughter faded, and his expression grew serious once more. "Very well," he said. "I will consider your offer. But understand this, human, if I accept, it will not be for your people's benefit. It will be because I believe it is what is best for my own." "That's all I ask," Marion replied. Alithar nodded, then turned to one of his advisors, a tall elf with silver hair and a stern expression. "Summon the council. We will discuss the terms of this arrangement." The advisor bowed and quickly left the room, leaving Marion standing alone before the Elven King. Alithar's eyes flickered back to her, and for a moment, something like respect passed between them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the back of the hall, leaving Marion standing in the midst of the Elven court. As soon as he was out of earshot, Lyra Sylviel approached her, her face pale. "You're mad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Marion turned to her, her expression calm but determined. "I've done what I had to do, what no one else was willing to do." Lyra shook her head in disbelief. "You've put your life in his hands." "Alithar may be many things, but merciful isn't one of them. He could have you executed on the spot and claim it was for the good of his people." "I know," Marion said quietly, but I'm betting that he won't." Lyra stared at her for a long moment, her silver eyes filled with both admiration and fear. "You truly believe in this, don't you?" "I do," Marian said, meeting her gaze. "Because I believe that peace is worth any price, even my life." Lyra opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the doors to the hall swung open once again. The Elven Council had gathered. They entered the room in a stately procession, their robes flowing behind them like waves of shimmering silver. At their head was Eldrin, the high-ranking sorcerer whose disdain for humans was well known. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto Marian, and she could feel the weight of his disapproval from across the room. The council assembled before Alither, who stood at the center of the chamber. He gestured for them to be seated, then turned his attention back to Marian. "The council will hear your proposal, President Marian. But note these are your fate, and the fate of your people, rest on their decision." Marian nodded, her throat dry. This was the moment that would determine everything. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, and began to speak. For what felt like hours, she laid out her vision for peace, her voice steady and unwavering despite the immense pressure. She spoke of the endless cycle of violence, of the suffering both humans and elves had endured. She spoke of the need for understanding, for compromise, and for a future where both races could coexist. As she spoke, she could see the council members watching her, their faces unreadable. Eldrin, in particular, seemed to be studying her every word, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. She knew that winning him over would be the hardest part, but she pressed on, determined to make them see the truth. When she finished, there was silence. The council exchanged glances, their expressions inscrutable. Then, Eldrin rose to his feet, his voice cold and measured. "You speak of peace, human," he said, his words dripping with disdain. "Yet your people have done nothing but bring death and destruction to our lands. You ask us to trust you, but why should we? What guarantees do we have that this is not some trick, some ploy to weaken us further?" Marian met his gaze, unflinching. "You have no guarantees," she said simply. "All I can offer is my word. But I'm willing to put my life on the line to prove that I'm sincere." Eldrin's eyes narrowed. "Your life is a small price to pay for the lives of countless elves." "I agree," Marian said. "But it's a start." Eldrin's lips curled into a sneer. "You are a fool if you think that your death will change anything." "Maybe," Marian said, her voice calm. "But maybe it will be enough to make you see that we're not your enemies. Maybe it will be enough to end this war." The room fell silent once more. Marian could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the council's decision pressing down on her. She had done everything she could and now all that was left was to wait. At last, Alither spoke. "The council will deliberate. You will be escorted to a guest chamber while we reach a decision." Marian nodded, her heart heavy but resolute. She turned and followed the guards out of the hall, her steps slow and measured. She had done what she came to do. Now, all she could do was hope. The hours dragged on in agonizing silence. Marian sat in the small chamber, staring out the window at the elven city below. The beauty of the place felt distant now, overshadowed by the weight of what was to come. She had no idea what the council would decide, no way of knowing whether her sacrifice would be accepted or if it would all be for nothing. The door creaked open behind her, and Lyra entered, her face tense. "They've made their decision," she said softly. Marian stood, her heart pounding in her chest. "And?" Lyra hesitated, then looked her in the eyes. "They've agreed to the peace. But there's a condition." Marian's breath caught in her throat. "What condition?" Lyra's expression softened, filled with sorrow. "You must die, Marian." "Tomorrow, at dawn." Marian closed her eyes, the weight of the words settling over her. She had known this was the price. She had prepared herself for it. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Thank you, Lyra," she said quietly. Lyra shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, Marian." Marian placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a small, sad smile. "Don't be, This is what I came here for. The night passed in a blur, and before she knew it, dawn was breaking. The sky was streaked with pale pink and gold as the sun rose over the elven city. Marion stood on the platform where her execution would take place, her hands bound, her heart steady. She gazed out at the crowd that had gathered. Humans and elves alike, come to witness the moment that would end the war. Alether stood beside her, his expression grim but resolute. He raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. Today, we end the war between our peoples, he said, his voice carrying over the assembled masses. Today, we honor the sacrifice of a leader who has chosen peace over bloodshed. Marion closed her eyes, the warmth of the sun on her face. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her, but she felt no fear, only peace. And then, with a single, swift motion, it was over.